Imagine walking into a restaurant getting insulted by a rude waiter, and then revealing that you actually own the place. That's exactly what happened to NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal, a.k.a. Big Shaq. One waiter had no idea who he was, and what happened next? It shocked the entire staff, went viral online, and taught the world a powerful lesson in respect. You don't want to miss this one. Imagine insulting a customer, only to find out later that he owns the place you work at. Sounds like something out of a movie, right? But for one unsuspecting waiter, this jaw-dropping scenario became a harsh reality, one he'll likely never forget. It all began on what seemed like a regular Tuesday afternoon at one of Atlanta's trendiest upscale restaurants, Crimson Flame. The lunch crowd had cleared out, and the atmosphere had quieted down. The waitstaff was relaxed, some even a bit careless, thinking the rest of the shift would breeze by uneventfully. That's when he walked in. Standing well over 7 feet tall, dressed in casual clothes and a hoodie, a towering figure stepped through the doors. No entourage, no paparazzi, no flashy gold chains or sunglasses, just a calm presence and a warm smile. To most people in the world, that massive frame and unmistakable face would instantly scream Shaquille O'Neal, the NBA legend, entrepreneur, and media personality. But not to Josh, the waiter on duty who would soon regret every word that left his mouth. Josh had a reputation around the restaurant. He wasn't exactly known for great customer service, more like selective courtesy. He prided himself on knowing who was important and who wasn't. So, when he saw a large man walk in alone, dressed simply, Josh didn't see a legend. He saw someone he assumed didn't belong in a place like Crimson Flame. Without even offering a greeting, Josh scoffed and muttered under his breath, "You lost or something? This isn't a burger joint." The man chuckled, unfazed, and responded, "Nah, I'm good. Just heard y'all got the best ribs in town." Josh smirked and said, "Not for you, man. Try across the street." The words were cold, disrespectful, and most importantly, a huge mistake. Because within minutes, the entire restaurant would come to a standstill. The general manager would come rushing out, staff would gasp in shock, and Josh's jaw would nearly hit the floor. Why? Because the man he just insulted wasn't just a customer. He was the co-owner of the restaurant. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq himself, had walked in casually, and Josh had just disrespected one of the most recognizable sports legends in the world and his boss. And that's when everything changed. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon at Crimson Flame, an upscale, sleek restaurant nestled in the heart of downtown Atlanta, the kind of place where reservations are hard to get. And the dishes are as much art as they are food. Usually, the dining room buzzed with energy. Business meetings over steak, influencers snapping photos of their plates, and soft jazz playing in the background. But today was different. The lunch rush had come and gone, and the place had settled into a mid-afternoon lull. The lights were dimmed just slightly, the music low, and the staff had loosened up. Among them was Josh, a server in his late 20s with a sharp jawline, slicked back hair and a chip on his shoulder. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed he was doing the restaurant a favor just by being there. In his mind, he wasn't just a waiter, he was someone important in a place, meant for important people. Josh had developed a bit of a reputation among his coworkers. He wasn't outright rude to everyone, but he definitely picked and chose who he gave good service to. If you were dressed in designer clothes, dripping in diamonds, or followed by a camera crew, he was suddenly all smiles. He'd remember your name, recommend the perfect wine pairing, and treat you like royalty. But if you looked too casual, too normal, or didn't fit his idea of wealth or fame, Josh barely acknowledged you. He thinks he's the gatekeeper of luxury, one of the line cooks joked behind the kitchen doors. To Josh, only real celebrities were worth impressing. Athletes, actors, TikTok stars with millions of followers. Those were the people he thought deserved his time. Everyone else, just background noise. So when a tall man in a hoodie and jeans walked through the door that day, alone, no security, no media buzz, Josh barely glanced at him. He instantly made a judgment. Nobody important, he thought. Little did Josh know that man wasn't just important. He was one of the most iconic athletes in the world, a global superstar, and more importantly, his boss. Josh was about to learn the hard way that pride comes before a fall, and some of the most powerful people walk in without making a sound. Around 3:30 p.m., the front door of Crimson Flame opened with a soft chime. The restaurant was quiet. No line at the hostess stand, no clinking of silverware, just the low hum of the kitchen and a few murmured conversations from late diners. And in walked a man who instantly stood out, but not in the way one might expect. He was tall, impossibly tall, well over 7 feet. Broad-shouldered, built like a wall, with hands the size of dinner plates and a presence that made the air feel just a little heavier. But he wasn't dressed like a celebrity. No suit, no designer sunglasses, no diamond watches. Instead, he wore a simple hoodie, pulled slightly over his head, faded jeans and worn sneakers, a look that screamed comfort, not clout. There was no entourage behind him, no photographers, no host announcing his name like royalty. Just this one massive man walking casually through the restaurant doors, glancing around with a soft smile like he'd been there before. Josh was leaning near the bar at that moment, sipping from a water glass and scrolling through his phone. He glanced up lazily, then did a double take. The guy was huge, sure, but something about him rubbed Josh the wrong way. He didn't recognize him, and more importantly, didn't want to. To Josh, the man didn't look like money. He didn't dress the part. He didn't carry himself with that arrogant, loud energy Josh had grown used to catering to. In Josh's mind, this was just another guy. Maybe some ex-basketball player trying to stay relevant. Maybe someone who had money once and was now pretending like he still did. Or worse, someone trying to get a free meal by acting important. Josh rolled his eyes and muttered to himself, "Another wannabe." He stood up straighter, wiped his hands on his apron, and prepared to do what he always did when someone walked in without the right look and dismissed them. What Josh failed to notice, though, was the small glances some of the other staff exchanged as the man walked by, eyes widened, brows raised. Because while Josh saw just another big guy, the rest of them were starting to realize exactly who had just walked into the room, and it was about to turn his entire shift and reputation upside down. The tall man took a few casual steps into the restaurant, his eyes scanning the elegant interior. Despite the low lighting and plush decor, there was nothing about him that looked out of place, except to Josh, who had already decided this man didn't belong. Instead of greeting him with the usual polite smile and welcoming tone that Crimson Flame was known for, Josh didn't even bother hiding his irritation. He let out a heavy sigh, barely making eye contact, and muttered sarcastically, "You lost or something? We don't do fast food here?" The words hung in the air like a slap. The man paused. His posture didn't change. He didn't look offended, not yet. In fact, he let out a soft, amused chuckle as if he'd heard this kind of attitude before. With a calm, friendly voice, he replied, "Nah, I'm good. I heard y'all got the best ribs in town." There wasn't a hint of arrogance in his tone. No demand, no ego. Just a man, clearly relaxed, maybe even excited to enjoy a good meal. But Josh wasn't interested in good vibes. He scoffed loudly, rolled his eyes for effect, and added, "Not for you. Maybe try the place across the street." It was meant to sting. It was the kind of comment Josh had used before on people he didn't think fit the room. People who didn't look rich, polished, or high-profile enough for Crimson Flame. But this time, something was off. From the other side of the restaurant, a busboy nearly dropped a glass. A hostess at the front desk stood frozen, her eyes wide, mouth slightly open. A bartender in the corner slowly leaned forward, trying to listen in. But Josh didn't notice any of them. He was too busy feeling proud of himself, as if he'd just defended the restaurant from someone unworthy of their menu. The tall man, meanwhile, simply nodded. No anger, no comeback, just a little smile, the kind that says, "All right, I'll play along for now." He glanced at the name on Josh's apron, then casually looked around the restaurant like he was taking mental notes. Josh thought he'd just sent a stranger out the door, but in reality, he had just insulted the owner, and the real show was about to begin. As the tall man stood calmly near the entrance, brushing off Josh's insult with surprising grace, a quiet ripple of realization began to move through the restaurant floor. Near the side station, two of the other waiters, Derek and Luis, had been casually folding napkins and prepping for the evening rush. But the moment they caught a proper glimpse of the man's face, they both froze. Luis nudged Derek with his elbow, eyes wide as dinner plates. "Yo, is that Shaq?" he whispered under his breath, his voice shaky with disbelief. Derek leaned slightly forward, narrowing his eyes. "Bro, that is Shaq. No way I'm wrong about that." The tension suddenly shot up. They both looked at each other, then back at Josh, who was still standing with that smug look on his face, completely unaware of the mistake he'd just made. Derek started to take a step forward, maybe to step in or say something, but Josh turned around just in time to hear their whisper. He scoffed and waved it off like it was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard. "Shaq, please." "That ain't him," he said with a laugh. Shaq doesn't walk around like a regular dude. He'd have bodyguards, cameras, people swarming him. Josh spoke confidently, almost arrogantly, like he knew the man better than anyone else. He leaned against the host's stand, arms crossed as if the case was closed. Luis frowned. "Man, I've seen him do commercials where he shops at Walmart. He's chill like that." But Josh wasn't having it. "Come on, bro. You really think Shaquille O'Neal is just gonna stroll into a restaurant wearing sneakers and a hoodie? No entourage, no press, be real." Meanwhile, the tall man had moved a few steps in and was now casually browsing the menu on a stand near the entrance, smiling as he heard every word. His back was to them, but it was clear he was listening, and he was letting it all play out. The other waiters started whispering among themselves. The line cook peeked out from the kitchen window. Even the bartender stopped polishing glasses, quietly mouthing, "That's Shaq." Everyone was beginning to realize the truth. Everyone, except Josh. And his wake-up call was coming fast. Despite the awkward energy in the room, the towering man remained perfectly calm. His shoulders were relaxed, his tone light, and his face carried the same easygoing smile he was famous for. He'd just been insulted, not once, but twice. And still, there was no anger in his eyes. Only patience, a calm that could only come from someone who had nothing to prove. He looked at Josh unfazed and said casually, "It's cool, man. I'll sit at the bar." Simple, respectful, as if he were doing them a favor by staying. But Josh wasn't done showing off. His arms were still folded tightly across his chest as he glanced over at the bar, which had several empty stools. The dining area had open tables, too. In fact, the restaurant was far from full. It was the slowest hour of the afternoon. But Josh, feeling the need to keep control of the situation, didn't budge. He responded coldly without emotion. "We're full." The words hit like a punch to the gut, not because of how loud they were, but because of how confidently false they were, a flat-out lie. At that moment, it became clear to everyone watching. Josh didn't believe the man was Shaquille O'Neal, and even if he did, he didn't care. He'd already made up his mind. He saw the hoodie, the casual jeans, the low-key entrance, and decided this man didn't deserve a seat. Shaq's eyebrows lifted just slightly, not in anger, but with a kind of quiet curiosity, like he was studying Josh, testing him. The room went awkwardly silent. A couple sitting near the window exchanged looks. The bartender subtly shook his head, muttering under his breath, "This dude's got no clue." Shaq looked around, clearly noticing the empty bar stools and the half-empty dining room. Still, he didn't argue. He didn't push. He simply nodded and said, "All right, then." Then he stepped back, clasped his hands together, and waited. Not for a seat, but for what he already knew was about to happen next. Josh, meanwhile, thought he'd just dismissed a regular walk-in customer. He didn't realize he'd just lied to and disrespected the co-owner of the restaurant, and things were about to change very quickly. Just as the tension in the air seemed thick enough to cut with a knife, the door to the back office swung open. Out stepped Mr. Carlos, the general manager of Crimson Flame, a sharp-dressed man in his 40s, known for running a tight ship. He usually moved with calm control, but today he was clearly in a hurry. He had come out to check on a delivery issue, glancing at his tablet when he looked up and froze mid-step. His eyes locked onto the tall man standing near the bar, and his entire body went stiff. The blood drained from his face as he took one long blink, trying to process what he was seeing, and then, in a sudden burst of urgency, he practically sprinted across the restaurant floor. It was a reaction none of the staff had ever seen before. Chairs scraped slightly as people turned to watch. "Sir," Carlos called out, his voice full of surprise and apology. "We didn't know you were coming today." The tall man, who hadn't moved an inch from his calm stance, gave a small nod and offered a friendly half-smile as if to say, "No big deal." But all eyes were now on Josh. He blinked in confusion, frowning as he looked back and forth between Mr. Carlos and the man he had just tried to kick out. The dots hadn't connected in his mind yet. He stepped slightly forward, nervously tugging at his apron. "Wait, what?" Josh muttered, blinking hard. "You know this guy?" Mr. Carlos turned to him slowly, eyes wide with disbelief. "This guy?" he repeated in a sharp tone. "Josh, do you even know who this is?" Josh shrugged, suddenly much less confident. "I mean, someone said Shaq, but—" Carlos nearly dropped his tablet. "That's because it is Shaq, Shaquille O'Neal, the co-owner of this restaurant." Gasps echoed softly from nearby tables. Even the kitchen crew peeked through the service window, stunned. Josh's jaw dropped, eyes darting back to the man in the hoodie, the same man he had dismissed with sarcasm and lies just minutes earlier. And that's when reality hit him like a freight train. He hadn't just insulted a customer. He'd insulted his boss and a global icon. The restaurant had gone completely still. Not a fork clinked, not a whisper escaped. All eyes were now on the towering man in the hoodie, and the manager who had just come racing out of the back, like his job depended on it. And it did. Mr. Carlos, now standing beside the guest of honor, adjusted his tie nervously. His normally composed demeanor was replaced with wide eyes and a shaky smile. The kind you wear when you're standing next to someone, very important in trying not to mess it up. With a slight gesture to the room and a clear voice, he said, "Everyone, please welcome the co-owner of Crimson Flame, Mr. Shaquille O'Neal." The moment the words left his mouth, the air shifted. Gasps broke out from the staff. A plate almost slipped from a busboy's hands. One of the servers literally mouthed, "No, freaking way." A customer seated near the window dropped their napkin and quickly pulled out their phone, trying not to look obvious. Shaq gave a humble smile and a small wave to the room, nodding to a few familiar faces. His presence alone now felt twice as large, not because anything had changed, but because now they all knew who he really was. And standing right in the middle of it all, eyes wide and skin pale, was Josh. He looked like he'd just seen a ghost, and in a way he had. But this wasn't a ghost from the past. This was the very real, very present, and very powerful co-owner of the restaurant he worked at, the same man he had just accused of being a lost fast food customer. Josh swallowed hard. His lips trembled as he tried to speak. "Key co-owner?" he stammered, almost choking on the words. Mr. Carlos slowly turned his head toward him, eyes narrowing with quiet disapproval. "Yes, Josh, co-owner, as in your boss." Josh's mind went blank. His legs felt weak. The smirk that had lived on his face earlier had vanished completely, replaced by sheer panic. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. All the pride and ego he had walked in with had been stripped away in an instant, and the whole restaurant had seen it happen. As the weight of reality settled over the room like a thick fog, all eyes slowly turned to the one person who hadn't said much since walking through the door. Shaquille O'Neal. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't flexed his fame or thrown around his authority. Instead, he stood calm, composed, towering not just in height, but in presence. Josh, now visibly shaken, stood frozen in place. His confidence had drained from him entirely. His hands fidgeted at his sides, his eyes locked onto the polished floor, too ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. A moment ago, he was the gatekeeper of who belonged. Now he looked like a child caught red-handed in front of the entire school. Shaq slowly turned to face him. There was no anger in his eyes, no bitterness in his voice, just a calm authority that somehow made his words hit even harder. He offered a small, knowing smile and asked softly, "You ever judge someone by the way they look, Josh?" The question wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the silence like a razor. Josh's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened. Instead, he simply stared at the ground, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. His voice, the same one that had been so sharp and dismissive, moments ago, had abandoned him completely. The other staff members instinctively stepped back, creating space around the two of them. It wasn't just out of respect. It was uncertainty. No one knew how Shaq would handle this. Was Josh about to get fired on the spot? Would Shaq publicly call him out? But the big man stood silently, watching Josh squirm not out of vengeance, but out of disappointment. Shaq's question wasn't just for Josh. It was for everyone in the room. How often do we judge people based on appearances? On clothes, body language, the lack of flash? This wasn't a celebrity moment anymore. This was a lesson, one that didn't need yelling to be powerful. And as the silence stretched out, thick with realization, Josh finally whispered something, almost too quietly to hear. "I'm sorry," Shaq nodded once. A lesson had been delivered, with dignity. After a long pause, Shaq finally broke his gaze from Josh and turned toward the rest of the restaurant staff. Waiters, bussers, hosts, even a few kitchen staff who had quietly slipped out from the back. They were all watching, wide-eyed and silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the customers, sensing something meaningful was happening, remained quiet. Shaq took a deep breath and spoke in a steady, calm voice, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. "You never know who's walking through those doors." He looked slowly around the room, making eye contact with several employees. His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't about shaming anyone. It was firm, wise, and real. "Always treat people with respect," he continued. "Doesn't matter if they're wearing a suit or slippers, whether they come in with cameras or come in alone. Everyone deserves dignity." A hush hung in the air as those words sank in. Luis, one of the waiters who had recognized Shaq earlier, nodded slowly. The bartender leaned against the counter, arms crossed, clearly reflecting on what had just happened. Even Mr. Carlos, the general manager, looked down for a moment, as if replaying times he may have let assumptions guide his decisions. Shaq wasn't just talking to Josh anymore. He was speaking to every person in that building. And beyond that, to anyone who had ever judged someone by appearances alone. "You don't need to know someone's name to show them kindness," he added. "And trust me, it costs you nothing." His voice was warm but carried the weight of experience. Coming from anyone else, those words might have felt like a lecture. But coming from Shaquille O'Neal, a man known for fame, fortune, and humility, they felt like truth. The staff began to nod, slowly at first, then more confidently. Heads bowed, eyes filled with realization. This moment wasn't just about a mistake. It had become a teachable moment. A powerful reminder in a world obsessed with appearances. Real character is shown through how you treat people, when you think they have nothing to offer you. And in that moment, respect had been redefined, not by status, but by integrity. Once the tension in the restaurant began to ease and staff returned to their posts, the warm hum of conversation slowly returned. Customers resumed their meals, though many were still whispering about what they had just witnessed. The presence of Shaquille O'Neal had turned an ordinary afternoon into a story people would tell for years. But for Josh, it wasn't over. Still pale and shaken, he tried to shrink into the background, avoiding eye contact, hoping somehow he could disappear. But Mr. Carlos, the general manager, had other plans. With a subtle nod, he motioned Josh to follow him toward the far corner of the restaurant, near the hallway leading to the office. Josh obeyed, head low, dragging his feet like a school kid called to the principal's office. But there was no shouting, no angry lecture waiting for him. Carlos stood with his arms crossed, letting a moment of silence pass before he spoke. His voice was calm, steady, disappointed but not harsh. "You made a mistake," he said, his words deliberate. "A big one." Josh nodded slowly, unable to look him in the eye. "I know," he whispered. Carlos studied him for a moment, then added, "But you're lucky Mr. O'Neal is a kind man." Josh finally looked up, his eyes filled with regret. He expected to be fired on the spot. In his head, it was already over. He'd embarrassed himself, disrespected a global icon, and now surely he'd lose his job. But Carlos surprised him. There was no shouting, no public humiliation, just a quiet, honest moment between a manager and an employee who had clearly crossed a line. "You've got potential, Josh," Carlos said, softening a bit. "But your pride is bigger than your sense. That needs to change, fast." Josh nodded again. "It will," he said quietly. Carlos gave a long sigh, then glanced back toward the dining room where Shaq still sat, laughing with the kitchen staff like nothing had happened. "He gave you a second chance. Most people wouldn't." Josh took a deep breath. He knew he'd just been handed something rare, a lifeline after a near, career-ending moment, and it was now up to him what he'd do with it. As the day continued and the staff began to recover from the whirlwind of emotions, one figure remained calm and collected at the heart of it all. Shaquille O'Neal, despite being disrespected, misjudged, and almost turned away from his own restaurant. He sat comfortably at a table near the back, sipping water and chatting with the kitchen crew like they were old friends. But Shaq wasn't done teaching lessons, not just with words, but with action. A few minutes later, after the crowd had settled and things seemed back to normal, Shaq gestured toward Mr. Carlos. With a subtle nod, he said, "Tell Josh to come here." Josh, who had been lingering near the kitchen, anxiously wiping down menus no one had asked him to clean, froze. His heart thudded in his chest. The walk over to Shaq's table felt like a mile. Every step carried the weight of embarrassment, fear, and uncertainty. When he finally stood in front of the NBA legend, he couldn't meet his eyes. Shaq leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable at first. Then he spoke in that deep, unmistakable voice, calm, measured, and direct. "You still want to work here?" Josh looked up, startled. He hadn't expected a question, especially not one so forgiving. His voice cracked slightly as he answered, "Yeah. Yes, I do." Shaq nodded once, then leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Then prove you can do better." There was a long pause. "Starting today, you're on cleanup duty." Josh blinked. "Cleanup?" "Yep," Shaq said, cracking a half smile. "Back of house. Trash runs. Scrubbing down equipment. Floor mopping. You name it." Josh nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." "And no complaints," Shaq added. "Because respect isn't something you're given in this business. It's something you earn." Josh swallowed hard. His pride still bruised, but this time, he understood. He hadn't been fired, but he hadn't been let off the hook either. Shaq didn't just give him a second chance. He gave him a challenge, one that would either make him better or remind him not to judge anyone ever again. And Josh, humbled beyond words, accepted it. That day, he didn't just start cleaning the floors. He started cleaning up his attitude. As the day continued and the staff began to recover from the whirlwind of emotions, one figure remained calm and collected at the heart of it all. Shaquille O'Neal, despite being disrespected, misjudged, and almost turned away from his own restaurant. He sat comfortably at a table near the back, sipping water and chatting with the kitchen crew like they were old friends. But Shaq wasn't done teaching lessons, not just with words, but with action. A few minutes later, after the crowd had settled and things seemed back to normal, Shaq gestured toward Mr. Carlos. With a subtle nod, he said, "Tell Josh to come here." Josh, who had been lingering near the kitchen, anxiously wiping down menus no one had asked him to clean, froze. His heart thudded in his chest. The walk over to Shaq's table felt like a mile. Every step carried the weight of embarrassment, fear, and uncertainty. When he finally stood in front of the NBA legend, he couldn't meet his eyes. Shaq leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable at first. Then he spoke in that deep, unmistakable voice, calm, measured, and direct. "You still want to work here?" Josh looked up, startled. He hadn't expected a question, especially not one so forgiving. His voice cracked slightly as he answered, "Yeah. Yes, I do." Shaq nodded once, then leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Then prove you can do better." There was a long pause. "Starting today, you're on cleanup duty." Josh blinked. "Cleanup?" "Yep," Shaq said, cracking a half smile. "Back of house. Trash runs. Scrubbing down equipment. Floor mopping. You name it." Josh nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." "And no complaints," Shaq added. "Because respect isn't something you're given in this business. It's something you earn." Josh swallowed hard. His pride still bruised, but this time, he understood. He hadn't been fired, but he hadn't been let off the hook either. Shaq didn't just give him a second chance. He gave him a challenge, one that would either make him better or remind him not to judge anyone ever again. And Josh, humbled beyond words, accepted it. That day, he didn't just start cleaning the floors. He started cleaning up his attitude. If you enjoyed this story and believe in treating everyone with respect, no matter who they are, then go ahead and hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that inspire, surprise, and teach powerful lessons. And if you want to see more stories like this, let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. And remember, kindness always wins.